She's the Goodman professor there. Simone does many things. Author of Making Sense of Lessons from Classroom Practice.
Hey, can you all hear me? Because I can't hear you at all. Hey, can you all hear me? Because I can't hear you at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now I can hear you. Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hey, can you all hear me? Because I can't hear you at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I can hear you. Sorry.
You're trying out this new Google on air stuff. Yeah?
So now you see everyone?
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Hi.
That's so exciting. Hey, nice to see you.
So now you see everyone?
I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people.
Hi. We just did an introduction for you. So
Hey,
now we're
nice
putting
to
you on the
see
big
you.
screen.
Thank you. I love an introduction. I see 1, 2, 3, 4.
Eric, it's pretty cool. Eric, we want to get up on screen for you.
That's why I close the computer. All right.
So I don't know if you're hearing me real time. But, I'll just tell you a couple things. One is that I'm a single mom and my son is homesick. So he should not be homesick, but he is. He is actually sick. So anyway, if there's any vomiting noises, I may just take a break.
It's reasonable.
And I will try to mute them for you. And then I just wanted to ask a couple other questions before I get started. And one question is, did you all read that article? Should I talk about that article, or do you want me to talk? So I wasn't quite sure if I should be addressing that question or not.
Some of us read the article and a few of us have not. So don't assume you've read it. Okay?
Right. So let me say this by way to start off, which is that I've done a lot of qualitative research in lots of different school settings, and that article, I will just say, is an unusual piece for me in the sense that I normally, everything I write normally includes my own voice, and I use I as a first person pronoun, and I write from my own position, but I don't typically write methodological pieces. And I wrote that piece that some of you read, and don't worry if you haven't. I have no, I don't believe in judgment about things not yet done. I wrote that piece because my tenure review committee said, you need to write 2 or 3 more articles right now without doing any more research because you don't have time. How about writing a methodological piece? And I kicked and screamed and said, no, I'd rather not. It's really not how I think of myself. I like to do pieces that I think of as being much more about, I mean, not to make a distinction between content and methodology, but I like to do pieces that I think of as being content driven rather than methodology driven. And they said, you know what, if you can write it because you don't need to go out in the field for 2 years to write it, just write it. So, so I give you that backstory in part to say that occasionally when people tell you to do things that you don't want to do, they are not necessarily right. I don't believe they're right. Often they are not right, but on occasion, it's a good idea. So the second thing I'll say about that article before I can go over some of the content with you, the second thing I'll say about that methodological piece is that because I was writing it under a lot of pressure, I didn't really think through the consequences of having people read it. Like I actually was so focused on production that I did not think about consumption in a nuanced way. I really was just writing and writing and writing to get something written. And it didn't occur to me till later. It actually didn't occur to me till it was published, much later, that I disclose a lot about myself in it. And I found that surprising because I'm actually kind of a private person. People don't interact with me and think that I'm private. People, when they interact with me, think that I have a big personality and I talk a lot. But I'm actually kind of private about things I struggle with, and so it was interesting to me to have this experience of writing something that ended up being quite personal in the sense that it talks about my religious orientation, and it talks a little bit about my screwed up relationships with my family. It doesn't talk a lot about that, but it talks a little bit about that. It hints at the fact that I have this ultra-Orthodox Jewish family, and they have very particular expectations of behavior. And so I have this very sort of complex Jewish identity. So, so after that piece was published, then people in my professional organization who do Jewish studies knew much more about my private, the way I think of it as my sort of religious identity, which was a little private. So here's another key piece of advice, lest you haven't gotten this elsewhere, although I think you might have already. One piece of advice is think about what will happen when people read what you write, because I often, for many, many years, I thought, you know, the only people who are ever going to read anything I write are like the 4 academics in the country who are interested in it, and, you know, maybe my brother if I pay him. But I really didn't have a sense of lots of people being interested in what I write, because it's true, mostly I don't write things that are very mainstream or very, or really of interest to a large population. So that was a funny thing about writing that article. But here's what the article was about if you didn't read it, and don't worry. It's basically about a comparison. It's a methodology piece where I'm reflecting on doing a study of Holocaust education in a fundamentalist Christian school and Holocaust education in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish school. And I'm not talking about the research. I talk with my hands, can you tell? I'm not talking about the research in that article. I'm talking about what it was like for me to do the research. So what was it like to negotiate access to those schools? What happens to my identity as a Jew in those different places? How am I received differently? And how do I then construct what I know and don't know? And so it's really a kind of, I think of that piece as being basically about what insider-outsider status as a researcher, what affordances and constraints there are in that dynamic. So let me just first check and make sure you can hear me and this makes sense. And you promise me you'll do something with your faces or mouths if you can't understand what I'm saying. Okay, good. So I think there are a few different pieces about that piece. If I were to summarize it, I'd say, basically speaking, because I'm a Jew, when I was and because I have an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family, when I was at the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community school, it was a yeshiva, it was a girls' yeshiva, and I was studying the 8th grade girls class, and they'd been together since the time they were in kindergarten, and they would probably be together till the end of yeshiva, which for them would be like 16, 17, sometimes 18 at the most, but mostly they'll be done 16, 17, and for the most part they'll get married by 19, maybe 20, 21, but the majority of those girls will be married by 19, and they'll start having kids, and somebody like my first cousin will have, 13 kids. So when I was at that school, I had these really funny dynamics between what I thought I understood and what I couldn't possibly understand, because I'm actually not that kind of Jew, and I don't come from that. I have that kind of family, but I'm not specifically from that sect. So that was a Lubavitcher sect, and my family is ultra-Orthodox, but not Lubavitcher. And so I often had this kind of funny dynamic about, well, what should I be doing as a researcher? What shouldn't I be doing as a researcher? Should I walk in the door and kiss the mezuzah on the door, or should I not? Because I actually don't do that in my daily life as the authentic human I am. And so there was just a constant tension in that school for me around, what do I know how do I participate as a researcher and remain a participant observer, and at the same time have authenticity to my own religious convictions and ideals, and not be offensive or odd. And so sometimes I was screwing things up just because I didn't know what to do. And sometimes I was screwing things up a little bit purposefully. And I can give you a good example, like, so I commuted to that school, and it took me 5 hours a day to commute. And I went every day because my daughter at the time was in daycare, and I live in Wisconsin. So and the school was not in the state. So I would drop her off at daycare, and I would drive 2.5 hours to where the school site was, and I would go to school, and then I would finish observing for the day and turn around and drive back 2.5 hours and pick my daughter up from daycare, and that was the day. And one time when I got there, I tore my skirt. I mean, I wore a long skirt, and I tore my skirt getting out of the car, and I knew that it would be offensive to walk in with a torn skirt because it implied that I wasn't going to be dressed modestly in the right way. And simultaneously, so I didn't want to be disrespectful, and simultaneously I thought, like, I don't even wear skirts. Like, I can't stand wearing skirts. Like, I've already gone this far for these people. I mean, that's not really the fair way to think about it, because of course it's my research. But I had a real dilemma, because it really, I mean, I'm expressing that resentment, but really, I remember in that moment thinking, I really want to go to school. Like, I don't want to miss this day of observation. I love doing this research. I love being in that community. I want to go, and I don't know what to do right now, because there's no way I can drive back home in 2.5 hours, get a different skirt, come back, or buy one where we are, Anyway, why am I sharing that? Because it just has to do with knowing your participants well enough to know what would be offensive, and then being trapped a little bit by knowing that. So that's a contrast with the fundamentalist Christian school, where I understand a lot about charismatic evangelical fundamentalist Christianity, and I understood a lot about it before I went to that school to do observations. But I understood fundamentalist Christianity mostly academically and mostly theologically. So mostly I had read a lot. I have some fundamentalist Christian friends, but not a lot. and I was not, and I had read a lot of portraits of fundamentalist Christian schools, but I'm not an insider in a fundamentalist Christian school, in the sense that I'm not a Christian, I'm not a fundamentalist Christian. So I was a real outsider in that school, and generally speaking, I found visiting that school as a result to be much easier on my soul. You know, it was much easier to walk in and think like, I don't know what I'm doing here, in the sense that I know how to be generally respectful, but I don't know when I'm going to be accidentally not respectful. Like, I would only do it by accident, but I wouldn't know when that was going to happen. You know, you just sort of walk into those situations. And so I can give you an example of when I can give you an example of doing something disrespectful that was completely unbeknownst to me. At this school, which I'm just for the sake of shorthand, I'm going to call them the Jewish school and the Christian school. Imply that they were uncomplicated places with very particular denominational affiliations and things like that. I'm just doing that for the sake of efficiency. That's okay with you? Yes. Okay. Good. So this one time I was in the Christian school, and there I generally was a much quieter researcher. It's partly because that school setting was much quieter. That school setting had the teacher talking most of the time, the students answering only short answer questions, and in that sort of typical IRE pattern, you know, elicitation, response, evaluation, move on. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say that? Yeah? So the teacher in that school, so the students in that school did not talk very much. So I certainly didn't talk very much, whereas at the Jewish school, the girls talked a lot. And they would talk to me, and so there was a lot more discourse happening, verbal discourse happening anyway. At the Christian school one time, the teacher said something about Jews, and it was patently wrong. I mean, it was and I had this moment of thinking, you know, this wouldn't happen at the Jewish school, but if it happened at the Jewish school, I'd feel okay saying something. But I'm a participant observer, but I'm really a quiet observer. I'm participating by occasionally like handing out a piece of paper. You know, I'm not really giving a lot, except my presence and warmth in this community, and my engagement and real curiosity. So I was just generally quiet. So anyway, she said, I think if I remember correctly, and I might not, the teacher said something like, you know, in the Old Testament, there's, she said something about horns. And I don't know if you know that there's a myth, there's an anti-Semitic myth that Jews had horns, and it comes from, this is just a side note now, but it comes from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. When the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek, that was called the Septuagint for its 5 books, and the word for rays of light, when Moses is coming down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, he's described as having, in Hebrew, it's rays of light. But that word in Hebrew, karnaim, gets translated into the Greek as horns of light. Basis for a very long-standing anti-Semitic myth that Jews have horns on their head or whatever. So the teacher in this 8th grade class, like, you know, says something about Jews and horns, and how you know, she's teaching about the Holocaust, and she says something about how they have horns, visible, and she doesn't say this in a she doesn't say this in any way that's mean-spirited or it's just patently wrong, right? Like it's deeply wrong. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting there thinking, and I remember this quite painfully, because I thought, if I had known this would come, it was coming, right? But but I don't know this is coming. It just comes up in class, and I sit there after she's saying this, and they've moved on because the discourse in that classroom was very teacher driven. It was very much about finding New Testament, and the kids in that class read this book by a Holland survivor who went on to be an evangelical Christian and missionized, and actually opened a home for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust in Holland, where she proselytized and converted people to Christianity. So they're reading that book. The teacher says something about how the Jews have these invisible, they have these horns, but they're not visible and you can't feel them. And she goes like this, and she's moving on, and I'm thinking, do I say something? Because it is obviously not the appropriate thing to do. It would be offensive. It's clear to me that it would be offensive for me to say something, and it's also clear to me that I would be swallowing my deeply held convictions about education if I shut up, right? Like if I didn't say, you know what, I know something about that. Would you like me to share that? Should I not share that? And it was a real dilemma. It was a real dilemma. And it wasn't a real dilemma because of the facticity of what I wanted to say. And it wasn't even a real dilemma because of the kids. I mean, if I'm thinking in my most idealized version of myself, I think like that dilemma should have been about what those kids left the classroom with and whether they thought Jews had horns or they didn't. But I know enough to know that if you're in a very, very insulated environment, and these kids were, and they're in this private school, they live in a community that's with only like-minded people, they go to church with only like-minded people, they will spend their lives with like-minded people. I don't think whether they hear 2 minutes about horns on Jews in 8th grade, and I say something or don't say something, is not going to change their opinions about Jews. Like I don't have any, you know what I mean? Like I don't have an illusion that somehow whether I interrupted or didn't interrupt, that would have a powerful impact on them. It was more like in that moment, I felt like if I don't say something, I'm sacrificing something of me. Like that is not what I can stand by. So I did interrupt gently, very gently. But I did interrupt. Like, how could I shut up? And it was rude. I mean, I did it as gently as I could. But frankly, even my discourse patterns sometimes of the fact that I'm talking to you from the Midwest, and it's where I am in the Midwest. Madison has the reputation of being politically liberal, and it is politically liberal, but it's socially very conservative. People don't think about the upper Midwest as part of the Bible Belt, but historically, actually, this part of the Midwest is sort of part of the Bible Belt. So it's very white, it's very Christian, it's very Midwestern, it's very polite, which usually means conflict averse, attending towards silence. All this is to say that I interrupted this teacher, and she was as gently and politely as I could, but it came from who I was in the class, right? It came from me anyway. And even when I'm like as gentle and polite as I possibly can be, sometimes it comes out as sandpaper against soft skin here in the Midwest. I mean, really, like sandpaper. I mean, you should think about that skin someplace private. It is not what anyway. So I did say something to this teacher, and I said, I know something about that. Do you want me to do you want me to share that? And she was like, oh no. And then they moved on. And the thing is, then I had this moral dilemma about do I even include that in the article? because that's my gap in a way. And simultaneously, it's not the story she wants told. And simultaneously, I have some kind of commitment to disclosing what I perceive and see. So anyway, this is all to say that in a million ways that I never expected, in both of those schools, you can't possibly think that because I was a Jew, I knew how to I'm such a different kind of Jew that even with Jewish family members, I didn't really, in all my interactions and in all my interpretations of that world, I was very conscious of the deep possibility of getting it deeply wrong by virtue of making assumptions about understanding. Whereas at the Fundamentalist Christian School, I was concerned with getting it wrong, but partly because you never know what you don't know, right? Like there, I was much more ignorant. So it meant that I asked better questions in interviews. Sometimes it meant that I asked, but it also meant that when you don't, I believe in the intellectual pursuits that we engage in academia. I believe firmly and truly and wholeheartedly that we learn, and that as we learn more, we get better at particular ways of thinking and particular ways of knowing. And I mean, I'm kind of a Hegelian that way. It's very out of fashion, I know, but I have an old school orientation. But all of that is to say that I would just say that in any context, identity, power, but it's anything, right? It guarantees particular kinds. It doesn't guarantee anything. It elicits particular kinds of highly specific, highly contextualized interactions that you can then use to understand each other better, or not. I mean, I at some point in the Christian school, here, I think I wrote about this, but I'll just say one last thing, which is at some point in that Christian school, I was friendly with the teacher. I mean, I interviewed her multiple times, and it was clear to me that she was actually kind of lonely. And I really do like her. I like her as a human. And I respect her choices. They're not any of them the one. And yet knowing her helps me understand her teaching and her calling and even her pedagogical styles and the school she's in and the marriage she's in. And one thing that was hard for me in the Christian school that was not hard for me in the Jewish school, although I don't think it was about the schools per se as much as these individuals in each, but in the teacher that I observed for months in the Christian school really wanted to be friends. And one thing that I struggled with deeply at the end of that project was the very clear knowledge in my head that despite liking her very much and being very grateful for the work I did in her classroom, and I knew two things. One, that whatever I write about the school, I shared it with them, and the very things I critiqued about the school, they love about the school. So there's no like scenarios when you do research in the hopes of changing the institution that you're doing research at, or changing the object of study. Like when we do, research on any form of injustice, you want to, you want to think that you're changing for the better. I really knew that coming into that school, no matter, any critique I have about that school comes from my radically different worldview. So the very kinds of things they're closed off about are exactly the things I think we need to open up and discuss. The very things they think are certain are exactly the things I believe ought to be challenged, disputed, deliberated, and are at the foundation of what it means to be a healthy democracy. So I knew going in, we're not going to agree on the premise of what my research is about, and we're not going to agree on its results. And that certainly held true. But I did feel very morally vexed about the second thing I knew, which is that as much as I really liked and deeply respected the teacher in that class, I didn't want to be her friend. And it's not because I'm an obnoxious person, although I am a little bit of an obnoxious person. It's mostly because like I'm a single mom. I have a full-time job. I have some friends that I love dearly whom I don't see enough. I have an elderly father. Like I have enough. I have it about more than I can handle. I don't see the people I love most in the world nearly enough, and I don't contact the people I love most in the world nearly enough. So that was a moral dilemma. I'll just put it out as a real moral dilemma. And in the Jewish school, that didn't happen, partly because such a different kind of Jew that I was much more of a threat in that community. And the woman whose class I observed was not that keen on me as a person. And I liked her very much and I respected her too, but I didn't, there's sometimes when you interview people and you really like them, and there's sometimes when you interview people and you think like, it is really interesting to be talking to you. I'm learning a lot about you, but it doesn't mean I like you. So anyway, I would say this is ridiculous and probably advice you don't need, but I do fully believe that, it's the relationships you create with the people you're doing research that are very powerful meaning makers. And so that the more trusting and the more open those relationships can be, the better chance you have of really understanding and writing about fairly that which you're observing. And the flip side is that there's a cost to doing that. And I don't think you ever want to feel like you're exploiting people, and you certainly never want to intentionally exploit people. But I think sometimes you end up feeling a little bit exploitative because, like with that teacher, with the first teacher, I don't even remember. Oh, isn't this terrible? I don't actually remember her name anymore. I don't remember her real name. I mean, I remember her pseudonym. I can't remember her real name. Anyway, I didn't want to be her friend, so it feels a little bad. But I can't be friends with anybody. Okay, I've talked, I think, for 30 minutes or so. Let me just pause for a minute. Is this the kind of thing that's helpful? Do you want me to talk about things you're actually interested in?
We've got questions for you, Simone.
Oh, I'd love that.
So why don't we those, and then we'll see if there's anything else that might be good for you to talk about. This is exactly what we want. So can you see us enough to take the questions, or maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can see the women in front of you, and man in front of these two women, and a woman to the left who must be to the right of the man, and that's all I can see. And then Trisha, your hands are behind the person. Yeah.
I don't see what ages. Write me.
I know.
I'm kidding. Okay, so let's take a quick. Courtney, you want to start with your question?
Sure. I don't think she can. Oh, she can't see me over here. I'll slide over.
And just identify yourself and give a little bit of context, Courtney.
Can you see me now?
Yes, it's nice to meet you.
Hi, my name is Courtney Cox. I'm a rising third year PhD student at Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. And my question was kind of, in reading the article, you kind of talk about this navigating the outsider status between the two schools. And just, you give really tangible examples of how that happens. One of my favorite ones is the thanks God example of kind of how you end up adopting some things that make you an insider versus how you navigate that different environments. Can you just talk about some of the maybe other challenges you may not have written about that kind of gave you that feeling of how you, especially in a multi-site project like this, how you continue to negotiate that and kind of either check yourself in terms of your positionality or kind of, maybe be a little more transparent, kind of, the way you describe in your piece.
Yeah, so let me make sure I'm understanding the question. You're asking for slightly different examples about how to navigate that insider outsider dynamic after the study was over, or did I miss something?
No, during that time. So whether as you're kind of taking notes, as you go home and review it, as you're kind of comparing the two schools, kind of how you understand yourself as an insider or outsider, and kind of how that's constantly shifting over time.
And I would add, can I add something? And sort of a little bit more about the process even of reflection. If you go home and write about it, or
Yeah. So ideally, I can tell you what I would do ideally. Ideally, I would go home and write about, ideally, I would go home and write up my notes from the day, from the content of the day. You know, so during class observations, I would record, audio record, I would write down everything I could, I would write notes about what I was seeing. I didn't have permission to video record in either school, so I didn't do any video recording. And I didn't write, I usually have a third column in my observational note taking. And usually that third column are things that I notice either about myself or prejudices that are coming out, or just moments of utter miscomprehension. So sometimes, so in the Jewish school, for example, occasionally when the girls would use, I speak some Yiddish, and I actually have pretty good Yiddish, but I'm not religious. And so because I'm not ultra-Orthodox Jewish, I don't know, some of the Yiddish turns of phrase that they're using are Yiddish. This might be too arcane, but Yiddish isn't a religious language. Like, people don't speak Yiddish to use towards religious goals. They use Yiddish to speak, to communicate, and Hebrew is in that community the language of sacred discourse. So sometimes the girls would use Yiddishisms for sacred Hebrew, but I didn't know the sacred Hebrew well enough to know what the Yiddish was. So I couldn't always, so in that third column for me would be moments where I would think, like, you know, where I'll write just moments of it's what we might say now, like WTF, right? Like, what just happened? What was that? Where did that go? Like, what was that? Or like, oh, that girl, you know. So in terms of the process, I mostly wrote from those first two columns. What are the girls doing? What's happening in the class? What are the classroom dynamics? Who's expressing enthusiasm? How can I tell moments of learning? What evidence is there of engagement? What evidence is there of insider-outsider status among girls' social groups? What discourse is being mobilized when? You know, all that kind of stuff that I was really interested in. Also, how do they think about genocide? Whose objects? You know, how are they talking about Jews and non-Jews? How are they talking about violence? I'm really interested in all that content. And only in writing this methodological piece, very occasionally in my writing generally, I'll use that third column, but only if it's sort of useful in the narrative that I construct about what I've learned or the findings I have. So that's sort of the process answer. And just to get back, Courtney, your question, I think about other moments of real tension. I would, or not real tension per se, not specifics necessarily, but I would say that one thing that I found really interesting to me is that when I did that study, I was very much, I was more open-minded about both communities. I mean, I actually think it's really, really deeply important not to do research when you are, I mean, you can make a counter argument, of course, but I think for me, I'll make this argument about me, which is that if I were to go back to that school now, I think I would be, I don't think I would be in the same place doing the research. My political positioning has mimics the rest of the country in some ways, in the sense that I've become more polarized in my positions, and I'm a little bit more extreme than I used to be. And I'm more resentful than I used to be in some ways. I'm really, I'm deeply offended by the politics. And this is not to say that I shouldn't have been deeply offended by them then either, but I wasn't as offended by those particular politics at that time. And that meant that I could go into those communities warm-hearted, open-minded, less, I wasn't going, here, let me give you an example. I wasn't going into a fundamentalist Christian school because I object to fundamentalist Christian politics. I was really going to learn something about how, I was really going to learn about my research question, which is how is the Holocaust taught and learned in that community? And I think if I were to go back right now, given given the last few years, first of all, I wouldn't do it because I have much more, I just have a lot of resentment right now, and I don't think that's a healthy place from which to do research, even though I think somebody else could make a really strong argument about how that can be the most important kind of research, right? You can go in thinking one thing and come out thinking a radically different thing, and so the process can change you. But I think in the ideal world, you go in receptive to that change rather than opposing that change. And right now, I would say about myself politically, partly because I'm writing from Wisconsin, and partly because since 2011, we've seen like the ravages of everything public here in this state. So I think we see it a lot nationally, but in Wisconsin, because we have a Tea Party governor, because we have a majority state House and a majority state Senate and a majority state Supreme Court, and really no opposition in any part of the governmental structure. It's not to say that there is an opposition, but we have seen just tremendous assaults on anything public parks, public schools, public universities, public spaces, public, so the vitriol against which minorities, disadvantaged folks, and the pace of legislation is stunning. And so because I'm aware of who funds which politics in this state and have seen such devastation so up close in precisely the worlds that I care about most, I'm not in the right place to do something with people I consider to be, you know, just hell-bent on ruination, just to use a religious turn of phrase. But and so I'm glad I'm not doing that research now. And it's funny because I can even tell you that I have a lot more patience with much less, how should I put this? So part of my work is also about post-genocidal states, and looks at, you know, places where people have murdered each other in the name of the state, right? So where genocide has occurred. And a really interesting problem I have is that I write from a place and believe in a place where people who commit genocide, I believe this, I mean, I believe this wholeheartedly. I believe that people who commit genocide can be forgiven and that it's explainable and that the vast majority of those people are normal people exactly like me, and that there, but for the grace of God, were I to be a believer in God, go I, right? That, as the turn of phrase goes. I have a much harder time right here, right now, because the politics of the state are because I live in this state rather than going elsewhere. So it's a very, very unfair, immoral, inconsistent philosophical position that I embrace.
That's great. So can we go to another question?
Another question, yeah. I'll be shorter-winded too, I promise.
Yeah. Oh, Sean. Here comes Simone.
Great.
And you know, we hear the beautiful tinkling of your wind chime. So we've got, like, you're evoking the whole rural thing. We're sitting out here in
I know. Well, you guys are in California. You don't have to go outside the second it's nice, but like we've had 10 months of freezing. So I cannot sit inside to talk to you on a sunny day.
It's working. Okay, here's another question from.
My name is Darshana. I am from Cinema and Media Studies Division. So my question is about the promise of shared research you have referred to towards the concluding part of your article. And I really like the way in which you laid out the dilemma of, whether you have to go back and give them a copy of the article and share the research in the promise of a transformation. And then you at some point says that I don't think they might need this research. These are problems they already know of. So my question is that this is a kind of dilemma which most of us face. Should we share the research? Is there a kind of credibility crisis if you don't share it? Will the people think that we have exploited them, made use of their time for our own purpose? On the other hand, if you expect that they have already known the reasons behind your visit, aren't we also presupposing our privileged position as knowers of a certain kind of truth which they do not have access to? So I'm interested in knowing more about this construction of knowledge, because all throughout your essay you were very self-reflexive in laying out your own positionality. So in terms of this, shared research, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about it.
I think you put it beautifully. I think I believe in sharing the research. I just don't believe in that kind of context. I guess it's a mistake to be attached. This is what Buddhists would say, right? It's a mistake to be attached to the outcomes of sharing, in the sense that the folks I'm sharing with have no interest. It's not only that they have no interest in, but they're theologically opposed to precisely the outcomes I want. So my sharing of research, I think, is important to do, not only symbolically, but actually. It's just that it is, in this circumstance, it is a little bit of a waste of their time. I'm not, it's a little bit indulgent. It's a little bit like I'm crossing the T of what's considered good practice, which is to share and to give the possibility of, not keeping academic knowledge within academia, but really allowing for the possibility of change. And simultaneously, it's also just sort of a provocation, because it is exactly what they, here, I'll give you a good example, which is that, when I gave the paper to the Christian school principal, he was very happy with everything I criticized. Mm-hmm. Right? Like he felt like, yeah, this is great. This is exactly what I think we're doing. This is what we do well, and this is what we should be doing. And I'm thinking, what you're doing is creating anti-democratic, closed-minded young people who are certain that they have all the answers, and that's actually really dangerous, and not even Christian. Right? It's not like, and yet, where do I come off saying that? And more than that, it's what I'm thinking of Christian isn't what they're thinking of Christian. And so, so because they didn't sign up to debate me, they signed up to help me understand their world. I feel less guilty about not sharing than I might have in other scenarios, but I did in the end share with them. It's just that, the funny thing is, at the ultra-Orthodox school, I shared with the community, and there was an article that got taken out in an ultra-Orthodox in a Yiddish paper, discrediting the article and saying about me, because I had written in the article about the Jewish school that, look, I wrote some very, very shortened version about what it means to be a Jew studying in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish school, and I wrote a kind of disclaimer that I think has academic integrity that said something like, I don't pretend to understand everything in this at this school, but here's a portrait of the way in which this particular subject matter is being plotted, what plot is being structured to it, and what that narrative is including and it isn't including historically. And the Yiddish in this newspaper, and it was interesting to me. It was a newspaper, a New York City Yiddish newspaper. Somebody took out a half-page ad to say that it was that this article was bunk, and that the author herself even said she doesn't understand this world. So why is she doing it? You know, I mean, so there's an example of sharing, but it invites, you know, it invited a real kerfuffle. But because I'm not in that world, you know, you can criticize me in a Yiddish newspaper. You can criticize me anywhere. I mean, that's what I actually think academia should be about, right? We should be exchanging ideas and criticizing each other's ideas. That's fine. It just would have been better for me in a if my Yiddish was a little better, it would have been better. And I wasn't going to pay money. I wasn't going to pay money to rebut him. So it's just dilemmas everywhere you look. Beauty of life. Okay, I'll shut up. Another question?
One or two.
Hi, my name is Anirban.
You want to go so she can see it? Do you mind?
Sure. My name is Anirban. I'm also from Cinema and Media Studies. You've spoken a lot about moral dilemmas today, and you wrote about negotiating access.
Yeah.
And you start by talking about the wig and the hat and what would have happened if I wore this or that. You know, I'm sort of wondering, in this process of negotiating access, is there any point at which you feel ethically that this is where I'm drawing the line? This is how far I will go to get this access, and this is what I will not do even for the sake of my research. Because at some point you also write about, you warn about going native, right? I did not want to go native, so I'm sort of wondering how you negotiate ethicality and your own subjectivity and the requirements of your research. So if you could just say a little bit about that.
Sure. So I can tell you, here's the thing. You know, at the time I did that research, I was married. And so that's why I wrote about the you know, would I wear the wig? Should I cover my hair? I mean, now I think that school for sure would not have even allowed me to come. Now that I'm divorced, so you know, there's a real I think there's a deep distrust of not only was I, you know, I mean, my insider status made me less appealing in that school in some ways and in that world than a real outsider I think would have been. But what you're asking, I think, is, let me see if I have this right. What you're asking is a little bit more about I'm sorry, I totally spaced out for a second. There turns out there's a little dead bird over there.
Simone?
Yeah.
It's really like, at what point to negotiate access and build rapport do your ethics come?
Yeah. Thank you. So I don't. I believe that when you enter a field and when you're negotiating access to any field, most places that you're really going to authentically learn from, you're not going to know what challenges they present you before you go into that field. It's the nature of learning, right? It's like if you knew what you were going to find, why would you be doing that research, right? So I generally, when I do research, I don't go in thinking this is where my line is, or this is what I'll do or won't do in a particular context, because for me, many of those contexts present what were previously unknowable. So the things that come up in the spur of the moment, or you know, or the kid who asks you a question about what you believe or don't believe, or you know, some of those you can have sort of stock answers for, but a lot of the time you're just sort of winging it. And so I don't have what I knew in terms of going native, quote unquote. I mean, I realize that's a, you know, problematic term. I knew that it was going to be complicated for me to figure out how to be in that context. But I know that about every study I do. I know some contexts will provide you with more ease, and some will provide you with less. And it's probably the case. I don't know if this is true, but I think it's probably the case that those that provide you with a little less ease are a little bit easier to learn from, because you're not so easily making assumptions about what you understand and know. But so no, I don't have I'm not a particularly good rule follower generally. And as a result, I'm just a little bit, I don't know what's the word I want, like, I am a little bit by the seat of my pants under the best of circumstances. So I'm definitely, I definitely am, you know, I'm trying always to be ethical. I'm trying always to think about beneficence. You know, what is it that's actually going to help the people I'm with, and not just serve this larger, you know, this academic population, or but I'm also kind of acutely aware of, you know, I screw things up. That's just the nature of the beast. And when you want to learn things, you just screw things up occasionally.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can you see me back here?
I can. What's your name?
My name is Joyce Marie. I'm an EDD candidate here at the Rossier School. I start in the fall. But I have not read the article, so next time I will read it.
I appreciate your honesty. Have no shame, guilt.
But I have a couple questions about the research process, because what I hear you saying is a lot of how important it is about the bias going into this type of research. So how much bias did you figure you actually had going into both of these different locations? And did you consider that when you were, I guess, the process of, you know, the end game and how this might change your personal ideologies on the biases going in? Because I mean, you've had a lot of anecdotal, which I didn't read the article, but information. But do you think it's important the bias that you have, or that to identify the bias? Not saying you had a bias, but to identify the biases going into the locations prior to the research and how that might change.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So it's a great question that comes out of a specific paradigm, which is a paradigm whereby you are valuing quantifiable, quantitative modes of research over qualitative ones. And here's why I'll say that. The notion of bias as infecting or you know, or skewing data comes out of this paradigm that's really about numbers somehow being impervious, right? And that, so it's human error that makes our quantitative analytics biased, or I mean, it's just one way of describing it, right? So I actually don't believe that, I of course know that there's bias, and I believe in bias, but I believe that bias is something that's deeply connected in that it's sort of like the tissues and ligaments of social investigation. And so what you want to, I think what we want to do as researchers is be utterly, as much as humanly possibly, cognizant of the way we're seeing, and to discuss the ways we're seeing, right? Use other people. And so I'll give you a really great example of bias. So so I was in, last week I was working in northern Minnesota, and I do work with religious educators, and so I was staying at a Benedictine monastery in northern Minnesota. And there was a group of 10 Tibetan Buddhist monks who were there. And there's a researcher, this guy, Richie Davidson, who scans monks' brains. You know, he puts EEGs on there and does MRI readings of their brains while they're meditating and not meditating. And I had this moment, so I was meeting this group of monks, and one of the Benedictine monks walks by. And so here's what you should imagine, right? The Buddhist monks, they have on these red robes, and they have shaved heads, and they're mostly wearing sneakers. Some of them are wearing flip-flops. And then this Benedictine monk walks by. This is day one. This Benedictine monk walks by, and he's wearing a dark brown robe. He has a huge beard. He has a shock of white hair. He has a white rope of a sash, and he has a giant cross, like a cross, you know, the size of my face, on his chest. And he walks by, and I caught myself thinking, I thought, oh, look, there's the real monk. And I thought, oh, yeah, can't believe, like, where did that come from? That is such a, like, screaming bias about whose religion has a, you know, hierarchy over which other religion and why, and it has everything to do with my Western European orientation towards learning and what I grew up with, you know, has all this stuff. And so to me, that's a beautiful example of bias, right? But I don't believe that we then get rid of that bias, like, oh, we noticed it and it's gone. I think what we do is take that realization and do something with it, construct it. I mean, what I did was I joked with this whole group of, but this is who I am, right? Like, I talk too much rather than too little. So I joked with this whole group of Tibetan monks. So I was like, oh, look, they're the real monks. What do you think about that? And then they were laughing, and, you know, and there's just a way in which I could make light of my own idiocy in that moment. Anyway, all this is to say, in research, so to me, that's a good example of a very quick, deep-seated, important to recognize bias, but one that's a little bit easier to disentangle, especially because I then spent 5 days with these Tibetan monks, and it was more like a mental habit. But I think there are much more nefarious, complex kind of orientations towards each other that don't just get recognized and go. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. Here's the mailman. Hi. I know, it's funny, huh? I think you would probably even see my dog if I. Anyway, what else? Let me see in the back window. Anyway, what I was going to say is, I think there are other forms of bias that are more that need to be surgically removed. They're not band-aids that we're ripping off. They're like they're orientations towards each other and knowledge and constructions of the universe that are more tumorous, right? That have to be repeatedly excised. That probably are certainly systemic. That are not only individual, and that require a lot of different tools to work on. So all of this is to say, I think bias is, I don't like the language of bias, but I will embrace the language of subjectivity and prejudice and racism and sexism and homophobia and like all of that, and that what we need to do with that is be not just be cognizant, but because it's not that we can tame our biases through particular orientations, which is what I think Buddy Peshkin was writing about, but more that we can harness those and exploit them and use them and grow in the process and help each other grow in the process. And please God, if there is such a thing, change the systems of oppression in which we function. How's that for an answer?
That's good. So, thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Yeah,
Very much.
Thank you.
And say hi to the mailman.
He's gone, but I'm really happy to meet you. And Trisha, we have to talk. I miss you. You're like one of the people I love, not one of the people I avoid.
I know. So
And
much.
all of you, I think you're incredibly lucky. That's all I'm saying.
Oh,
So
thank you, Simone.
nice to meet you.
Thanks.
Don't be shy. Bye.
Thank you.